Flavia, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Karibu sana. This is where we fix the nation.
Thank you for all the work you do. I really admire your ability to do this daily. So thanks for taking one for us already.
We admire you for also doing what you do daily.
Yes.
Like even talking to victims of sexual violence in a war situation and all. Now, getting into our conversation, Janet has the day's quote.
Right. The day's quote today is from Mother Teresa, and it says, "Do not wait for leaders. Do it alone, person to person." Do not wait for leaders. Do it alone, person to person. What's your reflection on that?
Well, for me, the first thing that comes to mind is Ubuntu, the concept of humanity, especially from an African perspective. I am because you am. My humanity is, I become human because you are human. If yours is compromised, then mine is compromised as well, especially in the context of Africa right now. I think what we really need is to see more Ubuntu, and I'm so thankful to have a conversation on Sudan in Nairobi at Nation Radio. It means then we're beginning to connect our collective humanity in the region. And I think that's something that's really suffered, especially when you look at the crisis in the region. When I think about Sudan, DRC, Ethiopia, many of us really have no idea what's happening across the borders. We've become a bit insular, so I'm hoping that through some of these conversations, and thanks so much for the opportunity, we can begin to center our collective humanity and realize that unless my neighbor, the person next to me, is able to realize their full humanity, then I cannot. So are we aware of what's happening in Sudan? Are we aware of what's happening in DRC? Are we aware of what's happening in Ethiopia, in South Sudan, and can go on and on? The regional office covers about 22 countries in the region, East and Southern Africa. And you know how the region looks like currently. You know, we can count about 6 or 7 countries where it's really, really chaotic. So thanks for the opportunity to be here.
There's conflict all around us.
Yeah.
And I mean, this situation has been like this for very many years. Yeah. That's why we even talk about Kenya being the beacon of peace, because there's no conflict in Kenya, that kind of conflict, this protracted kind of conflict. But all around us, there's let's talk about Sudan itself. And for people who've been living under a rock until this morning, what's been happening in Sudan?
Well, yeah. Amnesty has been working in Sudan for years, since even 2003. Yeah? So we actually have to pick our starting point. Either we're beginning at 2004 or during the Darfur situation, we're beginning in 2019 at the ouster of Bashir, we're beginning in 2021 at the coup, we're beginning in 2023 April where the conflict, these recent tensions mounted. But the reality is that we've seen what impunity can do. What impunity can do when you do not hold perpetrators of violence and atrocities to account. Because in 2004, so many entities, the UN, Amnesty and others, documented the atrocities that happened, crimes against humanity, and even characterized as genocide. And there were even ICC referrals of Bashir and others because of what happened, including sexual violence. Fast forward to 2025, we are now 2 years into the new conflict in Sudan. We are looking at a situation where 30% of the population has been displaced. Depending on which numbers you look at, whether you're looking at UN numbers or whatever, you're looking about 12 million people who've been displaced, 8 million of which have been displaced internally. 4 million externally. In fact, recently I saw numbers, I think on Al Jazeera, where they were trying to do a map of the neighboring countries, like which countries have welcomed how many. Egypt, 1.5 million, you think Singa 72 million, here 700,000 there. Even here in Nairobi, you know that we are now surrounded by so many Sudanese comrades who all of a sudden find themselves asylum seekers and refugees. So that it's currently the world's largest displacement crisis. Famine, acute hunger, about 23,000 people dead. The humanitarian access blocked, including for women and girls who need access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. Not because they've been raped and violated, which we can also talk about because that's the subject of our report. But you're a woman, the fact that you're a woman doesn't cease because there's a conflict. The fact that you're menstruating doesn't cease because RSF are fighting with SAF. You still need your menstruation, kids, you still need your contraceptive. If you're pregnant, your baby is coming, whether or not you're on the move, in the mountains of the hills. So there's a question around basically humanitarian access. And then now globally, what is now even more tragic is that the humanitarian appeal for Sudan, which I think is $4.2 billion, has only been funded to 6%. So where is the 94%? Where is the international community with the 94% that's needed for the people of Sudan? So if you've been under a rock and you're coming up now, there's war raging in Sudan. Right now, most recently, Zamzam camp, IDP camp in the Darfur region has been attacked. In fact, my colleagues are working so hard to figure out how to determine the facts on the ground. But what we know is that it's atrocious what has just happened there in the past 2 days. I've just come from Uganda. I've just arrived yesterday night. 15th April yesterday was the second anniversary, in quotes and big fat quotes, of the conflict, and I was there with Sudanese. Was a huge community of Sudanese people in Uganda currently, just to stand in solidarity with them and just to hear them what their hearts cry for and what they'd like to see. And a big call is really around justice and accountability and breaking the cycle of impunity.
So what happened on the 15th of April in 2023? Who's this who's fighting?
Yeah.
And why?
Well, it's a power struggle between two men. Because one of the quotes from our report is really around a woman who's saying, we are paying the biggest price as women and girls, but we have really nothing to do with this conflict. This is a conflict between two men struggling for points. I'm insisting on that because you just also need to see how militarization and masculinization of just how we sort out things in society is not working. But the issue is that after they overthrew the civilian military government, now they meaning Burhan and Hemeti, they also fell out because of the proposed reforms to the military, because the civilians were saying we need more oversight on the military and we need RSF to be absorbed into the military, and RSF, of course, seeing that they will lose power, they lose the clout that they have if they're absorbed into the military. And then, of course, there's also the call for justice and accountability, including for atrocities dating all the way back to 2003. And, of course, we know that when you start calling for accountability, these are the same people who are responsible for the same atrocities that we saw back in 2004. I'll give you an example. When we were doing this report on sexual violence, which I have here, it's titled "They Raped All of Us." This report, when we were doing it this year, we went back to the archives, the Amnesty archives. I wasn't working in Amnesty in 2004. I was a very young girl somewhere. But we went back to the archives because Amnesty has been working in this region for quite some time. We pulled out a report from 2004, July. It's a report on sexual violence in Darfur by the Janjaweed then. Who is the Janjaweed? It's RSF. If I would have blurred out the dates, you'd think it's the exact same report. I kid you not. If you go to amnesty.org from a report, sexual violence in Darfur, if you look at it and compare it with this one, They Raped All of Us, it's literally the same narrations from women and girls 21 years ago. Nothing has been done. Of course, there were the ICC referrals, and the Sudanese authorities never cooperated with the ICC, and we still have Bashir somewhere. But the truth of the matter is that because of that impunity, to 2025, we are now having a situation where women and girls are facing the same thing. So the findings we have in this report is that the RSF are committing widespread sexual violence in the form of rape, gang rape, sexual violence, torture, cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment. That's the summary.
Sometime towards the end of this interview, Flavia, I hope you can also almost challenge or call to action how we can collectively speak on behalf of those who are struggling. Before that, I try to think about whether bodies like the AU and UN are either compromised or ineffective. And if that's the case, then how do we have a neutral sort of like body that will be able to sustain peace? If AU haven't managed, if the UN haven't seemed to manage, then what happens? Who's going to push or stand in that gap to take Sudan towards peace?
No, that's a very good point, and it's the same frustration that we have. In fact, all the calls and recommendations that we have are largely directed towards the UN Security Council or the African Union. Starting with the UN Security Council, the call is really around several issues. One is that we currently have an arms embargo over Darfur. is actually an arms embargo over Darfur, and it has been extended for 1 more year, which means it's coming up for extension again. This arms embargo is really an acknowledgement that arms are a pathway through which you know, atrocities are committed and you violate the rights of civilians, especially in the context of conflict. This arms embargo is being violated by not just by the warring parties, but it's being enabled by externals, including the UAE, and we have seen movement of arms, including through Chad to Darfur. Basically, we're saying there's an active violation of the arms embargo. Our request and call to the UN Security Council has been to extend this arms embargo to the full territory of Sudan, not just to Darfur, but to the full territory of Sudan, so that, because the war is raging throughout the country, so it doesn't make sense right now to limit it to Darfur. Unfortunately, the arms embargo has not been extended. Rather expanded. It was extended for 1 year in terms of timeline, but in terms of its coverage, it remains a Darfur arms embargo. So that's one of the calls we're making to the UN Security Council. But as you rightly put it, there's currently a kind of a breakdown in trust of the multilateral system. The UN Security Council is in some kind of stalemate, you know. Last year, Russia vetoed a resolution at the UN Security Council asking for humanitarian assistance for Sudanese people and the cessation of hostilities against civilians. Who vetoes that? Who vetoes food and protection for people? It tells you the kind of politics at play. And now with Trump, with the US factor, we are yet to see what that means. And in fact, we'll be testing it towards the end of this year. The other thing we're asking of the UN Security Council is actually to extend the ICC referral that is currently existent over Darfur to the rest of the territory of Sudan, because violations are actually happening in the full country. Because these are coming from the Darfur history. So it makes sense at that time. But right now, it's in Khartoum, it's in Jazeera, it's in the north, south, it's everywhere, this conflict. At the AU level, it's just a failed leadership, if you ask me. They have not stood up to the task. When you talk about African solutions to African problems, the first point of call is the African Union. So we're also calling on the African Union to do more, to show more leadership.
Can we have a neutral, is there any hope of a neutral?
I'm not sure
sort of like
what neutral
mediating.
Yeah.
Because these bodies should ideally be neutral.
Right.
The AU, the UN should be neutral.
Yeah.
So I don't know
how much more neutral,
we could
or if
get.
those have failed. I think what's bugging me is, okay,
Where do we go?
Where do we go? Who can step in?
Where do we go?
I know
Mine
they
is,
should, but who can step in? Because it's happening right now. It means that there needs to be somebody to facilitate these negotiations or so. But it almost sounds like everybody who's supposed to be doing it, as you've so explained so well, you can see where the gaps are. And that's just, I'll pin that
gaps.
in.
There are huge gaps, Janet, and that's why I'm really personally looking now at the longer route that will take us much more effort and energy. It's really about the people. It's really about the people, and it's so important that we show up for each other, and we show up as a collective, we show up as Africans, and we put the pressure on the African Union and all the other entities. It's a longer route. It may not give resolutions to a Sudanese woman now because we are still gathering ourselves, but I think eventually we also really need to consolidate how we call our systems, especially at the African level, to account.
Right.
Yeah.
My problem fixing comes from a point of who benefits from this. Wars don't happen unless someone stands to benefit from, because that would be my way of attacking it. Cut the head of the snake off. So who does benefit from the war in Sudan? That would be my fix. Those are the people I would want to go after.
Yeah, depending on who you ask. This has, of course, there's the warring parties who are like at the national level, at the Sudan level. Yes. But of course, you have the external entities, and of course, the geopolitics of the day. Egypt and Saudi Arabia supporting SAF. You have the UAE supporting RSF, and you have, Chad being a proxy to RSF and that. So there's also the geopolitics of the day, and of course, there's always the resource question. Even when you look at the situation in DRC, you can look at it from the domestic perspective in terms of just breakdown of rule of law and governance and accountability. But at the same time, there's always that outer layer of for who does this work, this status quo continue to serve. And you'll always find that is Africa, unfortunately, many of the crises we have is that external ring and layer of entities who stand to benefit. And in this case, of course, you have to trace the geopolitics of it all and see what is the place of Ethiopia, what's the place of UAE, what's the place of Egypt, what's the place of Saudi Arabia, the US, and so on and so forth. And I think just to bring it also back to Kenya, I think we could do better in terms of just championing the island of peace. I think we take that for granted. Two things. I think we have a role to play in terms of just being a leader in the region. And we shouldn't take for granted that we actually looked upon as a leader. Yeah. Two, we should not allow Kenya to also be used as a safe haven. And protect those who are violating rights in other contexts. We've seen the headlines around, RSF and the proximity to Kenya and certain things happening with the pronouncing and all those things. I think it's important that we do not lose sight of our responsibility to protect human rights, not just within the territory, but also in other contexts and countries. And even when it comes to the question of sexual violence, for example, because this report is really around sexual violence and how women's bodies have become the battleground for these leaders, how do you connect that with normal society? Because normally when sexual violence happens in a context of a conflict, it's a reflection of what happens in that society when there's relative peace. So even for Kenya, even though the whole situation around femicide, gender-based violence, and all these things, right now we have a task force on femicide. We should not be mistaken to think that, God forbid, one day if we're in a situation where we're in conflict, that these things will not replicate. They will replicate and they'll be amplified. So it is in our collective interest that the question of gender-based violence, femicide, sexual violence is addressed in society when we can still face each other without holding machetes and understand that equality and women's safety and things like that are an imperative to any normal functioning society. So that, because what you're seeing in Sudan, it's a reflection of how women and girls have been handled, perceived in times of relative peace. It means the patriarchy, misogyny, sexism is common fodder. And now in a conflict, what happens is amplified. It's amplified because how do you explain this level of sexual violence?
You've said something really interesting, Febe. Yeah. You've talked about the fact that once we're at this point, as we're able to speak face to face and address issues around sexual violence, gender-based violence, in a society that would care enough about us to do that, so let's say we're talking of a good scenario, how do you think that can then inform how women and girls like this would then end up being somewhat shielded or protected even within a conflict? Is there a link between being able to say we're addressing gender-based violence, we're addressing femicide, we're putting measures in place, and then again, in best case scenario, these measures begin to work. The country and the region begins to prioritize gender-based violence and say, this is a crisis, we're putting protection, and then that works. How does that spill over to kind of all the other women and girls who find themselves in situations like those in Sudan?
Yeah, if you're able to address it during quote-unquote normal times, relative peace, it means then you're beginning to plant into the psyche of the entire community and society that women and girls are human beings with dignity and violence is not acceptable and so on and so forth. So it means even if you are, God forbid, to find ourselves in a situation where now it's armed battle and the fighters and so on and so forth, the first point of call is not the bodies of women, because these same people have been socialized to understand and to know that women and girls are beings who are deserving of dignity and respect and not sites of violence. But you cannot start planting that seed when there's fire raging everywhere, because what you're seeing in terms of sexual violence in conflict is basically a reflection of how women are perceived in that community, in that society. And now there's a breakdown of law, there's no police, because one of the things that these women in Sudan reported to us in this report is that none of them had access to medical care. None. And these are women you are speaking to now in a refugee settlement in Uganda. And we ask them, what do you want? What do you need to happen? I need medical care. I have kidney problems, I can't walk, I'm having difficulty with this, never accessed. The second thing they're saying is that they need protection. They need to be protected, because who said once as a victim that's the last time you'll be a victim? You can be multiply violated. You can be multiply. It's a tragedy, but it's a reality. You can. Yeah. And then the third thing they're asking for is justice. That the people who did this to us, to me, to my children, to my wife, need to be punished. And now to reflect back on society, just to my last point on your question, Janet, is that the stigma of sexual violence, if you can address the stigma of sexual violence in normal times, i.e. if you have undergone this, then you're not stigmatized and you're not scared of reporting, then it means that if it happens in a situation of active conflict, then it means that you're not fearing to also report and you're not stigmatized. Because we also have survivors who said, my husband left me because I was raped. And I was raped by the RSF and he left me, or I have a baby out of the rape and now I've been left. But if you had dealt with that kind of stigma before, then it means the impact on the women will be much reduced in the context of crisis, as we're seeing in Sudan. Okay. Yeah.
It's really jarring to see these reports like this, because we know sexual violence is used as a tool of war, but the extent is really, really, really jarring. For communal, I don't know, how do we move as Africans to protect the women of Sudan? And I'll just go specifically. Ending the conflict, we're trying to look at it from a place of mediation and finding peace, but how do we move as a continent to protect the women of Sudan even through this conflict? Because like you said, the long route might take a while.
Yeah. I think one thing, if I was to just give a very concrete ask, is those who are responsible for humanitarian assistance need to prioritize the needs of women and girls. And by that I mean sexual and reproductive health services, whether it's post-exposure prophylaxis, whether it's... and there are women who are on the front line. I don't know, guys, if you know about the emergency response rooms in Sudan. They're led by women. Women on the front lines, women who are working under extremely difficult situations. Can we support those emergency response rooms? Can we ensure that humanitarian access also looks at the unique needs of women and girls? That's one thing. Another thing is to really push for the question around protection of civilians. International humanitarian law is being trampled on every day in this ongoing conflict. Civilians are just open season. Like it is, there's no parameters of how, the rules of war have been completely discarded. International humanitarian law is completely being decimated in Sudan as we speak. Can we prop up more the whole discussion around how do we protect civilians? And this is not just RSF, it's also SAF. Because Amnesty is not just documenting sexual violence, we've been documenting the bombings, the looting, the deliberate killings, the torture, and so on and so forth. And the blocking of humanitarian assistance, that's also a violation of civilians, because how then does the civilian population survive? Why are we attacking at IDP camps? So the question around protection of civilians, I think, really needs to be at the forefront of everyone's mind, even as we figure out the question of impunity, justice, and so on and so forth. If you're to do something today, I would say, is to really push that message that the international community needs to call upon the warring parties to ensure that civilians are protected, even as we find a resolution to this conflict.
Oh, we have to take a short break now, but when we come back, I'll ask how we do that when we know so little of even of the conflict. So much of it is shielded, and we're trying to get as much information as we can. But how do we work with all those constraints? How do we make things move? Of course, and as a nation, as a continent, how do we do this? Hashtag is Fixing the Nation NTV. We'll be right back with Flavia. Any questions, please put them on the YouTube link, on our Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and we'll be more than happy to ask. We'll be right back.
Thank you.
Indeed, we are hosting a conversation around Sudan, the crisis in Sudan. Yesterday, the 15th of April, marked 2 years since this conflict just erupted in Sudan, when forces from the Rapid Support, they're called the Rapid Support Forces of Sudan came into Khartoum and they launched war against the Sudan Armed Forces. Now, those two generals fighting since then. Now, some things have happened. IGAD met and said, okay, we've got to seek ways of resolving peace around this region. Formed a quartet, Kenya, South Sudan to lead it, and the other members are Ethiopia and Somalia. Now, there have been issues here. First of all, the Khartoum government saying we do not want Kenya to lead this. Kenya is not impartial in this particular process, and so on and so forth. We shall come back into the politics around the IGAD process itself. But first of all, Flavia Mongovia, Deputy Regional Director, Amnesty International, East and Southern Africa. As you get into the question that Mariam had asked, so how do we get to know more about the conflict in Sudan? How do we then get to support if we don't know more? You have met some of the victims of this conflict and you've spoken to them. Tell us, from the day that war came to their home, their village, what happened to them up to date?
Yeah. Oof, yeah, it's quite heavy because some of these people who've been affected by this conflict are actually now colleagues, people we work with very closely, people who are a pathway to information as to what's happening every day. So several scenarios. Picture Nairobi. How's the population of Nairobi now? 5 million.
Yeah.
Because the numbers I saw yesterday, I think the people who have been displaced from Khartoum is 3.5 million. Just picture 3.5 million people have left Nairobi. Which direction are we taking? Let's map out our path. I come from the coast.
Yeah, Nairobi right now.
I come from the coast, so do I
head towards coast?
My husband comes from Bungoma. Are we taking Bungoma route? Like, what is the plan? Yeah. So many went to Port Sudan. Many went to Chad. So it's almost like now the class issue also emerges, because who's able to take a flight, who's able to take a boda, who's able to take a taxi, who's able to drive out, and so on and so forth. I know people who were able to take flights to Nairobi and they landed here, people who are even working in embassies. In fact, if you look at our website, we have a story of a Sudanese lady who used to work at an embassy in Khartoum, and now she's in Nairobi with her family. 2 years on. In fact, we should check in on her and see how she's doing. And now she's selling Sudanese food, cuisine, food that people miss from home, from her kitchen, because you have to survive, you have children you have arrived with, but they were able to get to Nairobi. So that tells you that even just socioeconomically from back home, they had some options and choices as to how they move. Others went even to the US and Canada and so on and so forth. And then you have those ones who can only make it next door to Ethiopia, who can make it maybe to South Sudan, and then down to Uganda. In Uganda yesterday, and I've gone to Uganda quite a bit since this conflict broke out. There's a huge community of Sudanese there. I think there's also something to be said about how Uganda has been very welcoming, because the number of Sudanese in Uganda is quite something. There are stories.
Where are they in Uganda? You know, when you say Uganda,
Kampala.
you just think they're in Kampala?
This is Kampala.
So they've come all the way to
Yes,
Kampala.
and then of course there's those who are in the refugee settlement, because our research was actually done in the refugee settlement, Kiriandongo. So there are those ones who are the refugee settlement. There are those ones, of course, I'm sure others in Entebbe and so on and so forth. So you have groups that manage to drop all the way to Uganda. Others are terminated in South Sudan. Others are in Nairobi. Others are in Egypt. Egypt has been quite hostile at some point and actually sending people back to Sudan.
Yeah.
And then also think about this. Sudan used to be haven for many refugees from the region, including Eritreans, Ethiopians, especially when the conflict in northern Ethiopia was raging. So you are a refugee, and then you find yourself either being returned. Eritrea is not a place you return an Eritrean if they run away from. You know what will happen to them if you know anything about that country. So it's quite shocking. When you talk to some people about their displacement journeys, even what's happening at the checkpoints, especially in terms of women and girls. In fact, I have in the research here, we have one family here, Aziza, 37, and her daughter, 17, together with other women who are traveling to Madani. 7 RSF soldiers stopped their bus at a checkpoint. asked them to get out of the bus. They sexually harassed all the women in the bus, including herself and the daughter. They aggressively touched them, including on their breasts, their thighs, in a very humiliating manner. It was not comfortable, and they were very worried that they might be raped.
Yeah.
So this is now best case scenario, because they were only groped and touched and things like that. But the daughter is still very traumatized by that experience to this day. So now it's really tragic, because now we are now looking at it could have been worse.
Yeah.
It could have been worse. But this is an experience of women and girls to move from one point to the other. So the survivors we were speaking with, many of them, to find themselves at the camp, it's because of the experience they had of sexual violence. Then they realized that this is... I actually spoke to a Sudanese friend now who said her biggest fear is that of sexual violence. That's what made her leave Khartoum on the second day. So April 15th, 16th, 17th, she was out because of the fear of sexual violence.
You know, I've just, as you were speaking, I just remembered, I think civil society, I think even especially women, played such a huge role in toppling Bashir, right? And I guess now their voices are silent because of this. Is that how we can do that math and equate it? Because their voices were quite loud then, and it ended up, you know, pushing over. But now...
Someone actually was theorizing on that. The women of Sudan are strong, they're vocal. As an activist, as a feminist myself, I'm in awe of what I saw, especially during the revolution, in terms of the voice and power of women, Sudanese women, of all walks. So there's someone who was saying that what we're seeing now is really almost like putting people back in their place, you know, like silencing this energy, this
an
agency, and just clamping down on it so that it will not easily. And that's why I was saying you have to fix some of these things in peace times. The whole thing around how do we perceive women and their place in society.
And for men, the men who are maybe trying to even look after their families, I wonder if there's a pressure for them to either join one of the groups, and what happens to those who are trying to also find a better space for their families? How are men also compromised and affected in some of these situations?
In fact, it's something that I'm hoping we can document more of, even the whole question around sexual violence. And it's not in any way to take away from the magnitude of the violence that women and girls are facing, but I think we cannot close our eyes to the fact that men and boys are equally targets of this. And also, the sexual violence is being used to humiliate, basically to break down community and as we know it. For a man to leave his wife because she was raped by the RSF and maybe got a baby by the perpetrator, it means then you've effectively broken down the family unit and the society. And actually one of the cases we have here is of a woman who was raped, got a baby, and the husband has since left. So the aspect of humiliating. And then of course, if you speak to Sudanese experts, there's a whole history around how the sexual violence has been used. Remember, SAF and RSF were one. You know, if you trace back, right now the two generals are not seeing eye to eye.
Yeah.
But this
was
is
one
unit.
military.
Exactly, this is one unit. So they have used this as a tool in conflict for years, and the playbook is the same across the two sides. Yeah.
There's a question of our place in all of this.
Yeah.
First of all, Smallest Ever says, women and girls face unique horrors in war zones. It's the sexual violence which gets highlighted. Men and boys suffer too high combat deaths, but their plight is also less discussed. Broader awareness is needed, and that's very, very true. But he also said, when I look at what's happening, I get worried. Kenya is not immune to the same.
It's not.
Anything could lead us to a situation like this. But there was also a question of what is Kenya's role in all of this. I know we've tried, and Eric spoke a little bit to it, but are we doing all that we could as neighbors? Because again, violence begets violence, right? So it's in our best interest to have neighbors that are, safe and free of chaos and free of war.
Yeah.
But even from just a humanitarian perspective, are we doing all that we could be doing?
I don't think we are doing all that we could be doing. I think there's still so much more we could do. And the first thing I remember I mentioned earlier on is really leading by example and being a champion. Because even, I think there was a memo from Prime Cabinet Secretary Musalia when there was a questioning around the hosting of RSF. I think it was 23rd February, where now we were defending Kenya's position on that matter. There was no mention at all of the atrocities that's happening in Sudan. There was no mention, even the word human rights or protection of civilians or the place of justice. Like, that was an opportunity to say, while you guys are setting up your different situations, whether it's governments or not, Kenya should have reminded Sudan and the warring parties of their obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law to protect civilians, ensure justice and accountability. We didn't even take an opportunity to do that. So I think there's definitely a lot more to do.
Yesterday, though, just to be fair to the Prime Cabinet Secretary, he spoke yesterday. In his statement, he was talking about the humanitarian crisis in Sudan. He said, despite ongoing humanitarian effort, there are still severe access constraints, particularly in active conflict zones, and funding constraints continue to hinder aid delivery. We are deeply concerned about the plight of the displaced populations, and we will remain focused on supporting humanitarian assistance. And that's why he was saying yesterday that the international community should sanction both sides, all leaders who, especially those who are obstructing humanitarian aid, that the international community should come up and sanction those and say, you by name, you are obstructing aid reaching to humanitarians. We need to begin pressurizing or sanctioning and declaring clear consequences for those who continue to obstruct the work of humanitarian agencies. That's what Musalia said yesterday during the London Sudan conference at Lancaster House.
Super. That's refreshing to hear, and I'd like to hear more of that, and actually beyond the rhetoric, proper action, and not doing double speak where we say one thing and support another. That's definitely refreshing to hear.
How should Kenya deal with this particular accusation? So now here we are, the countries in the region, IGAD, say they trust Kenya. And they say, Kenya, please help mediate on the issue in Sudan. And Kenya takes up leadership of these quartets: Kenya, South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia. Try and see how you can resolve this issue. And immediately, one side says that we are partisan. How should Kenya deal with such a situation?
I think it's to demonstrate that our primary interest is the people of Sudan and respect of human rights and international humanitarian law. And I think that by our actions should be very clear and obvious, because being accused of that, it means then people are maybe not convinced that you're of a particular position. So if I was Kenya, I would, through pronouncements such as the one that you're hearing, where we're saying both sides, you need to behave, we need to ensure humanitarian access is accessible, then I think eventually it'll be very clear that we are for the people of Sudan, and we have not taken sides with any of the parties, because it's very difficult to be in such a situation where you're being called to mediate, and one side is not very convinced of your neutrality. So I think Kenya should continue to demonstrate by fact and by word that this is not the case. Concretely, what will that look like? One, maybe it's to...
Should we evict those who are said to be supporters of RSF who are in Kenya? Because that's part of the conflict. Part of the issues that even the SAF side of Khartoum has said, like, we are recalling our envoy in Nairobi and all, is because he's saying you guys are hosting the other side.
Yeah, no, that one, that's a tricky one, and I'm...
Diplomatic landmine.
It is not General Hemeti who's here. It is people who are said to be on the side of RSF and all. So what would you do, Mariam? Should you say anybody, when in Sudan, whether from SAF, Toka?
All of them out.
Because then what are we saying about humanitarian crisis if we are saying kick them out?
Because who are we hosting? I think, to her point, I would be more worried about, am I hosting Sudanese refugees? Am I helping the people who are trying to get out of there find, some peace and some stability here? If Nairobi is hosting members of the RSF and the SAF, that's a whole other... I don't know who to evict to. That one I can't answer to. But if I did show...
RSF is military.
Yes.
Are we hosting soldiers in Nairobi?
Oh, no, that's a different thing.
I
thought it was civilians.
So we have civilians. Now, these civilians are accused of being partisan to the one side. Okay? Just the same example that Flavia has given us. This person who left Khartoum, sought refuge in Nairobi, they have not disassociated themselves from their country. Now, if they start gathering in a group because they want peace in their country, and this is the way they know peace, and then one side says, the way these people are meeting, hawa ni watu wa mlima, wa side moja. Should we evict them?
I think showing non-partisanship wouldn't be necessarily evicting them. We do have a problem of hosting actually warring factions here. People will tell you about how people from South Sudan, who are the cause of their problems, are neighbors in Nairobi's nicer neighborhoods. So we do have that problem. Is eviction the answer? I don't think necessarily so. I think more showing that the people of Sudan are a priority, like she said, would be my immediate worry. But I don't think I'm diplomatically informed enough.
I mean, but that's a fair response. I mean, he also hosted Bashir when he was under ICC, and I don't know. I don't know what we don't.
Can I just? Well, there's something I wanted before we run out of time, and this is just to draw on so many other conflicts that are happening. How do we give teeth back if international law ever had teeth? How do we give it back teeth? International bodies as well, because like you said, international law is being flouted left, right, and center. Whether it's here, and there's always big players. So if you say it's the United Arab Emirates, it's Russia. Whether it's the US vetoing things that have to do with sanctions on Israel. At the end of the day, it's big players making those decisions and cutting the teeth of international law, but it is the people of Sudan, the people of Congo, the people of Ethiopia, the people of Palestine that suffer. How do we give international law teeth?
I think all of us have to be custodians of the same international law, states and the people. And that's why I keep saying, for me, there's really no shortcut. I think we need to just keep calling on the custodians of the same, whether it's at the African Union, at the United Nations, whether the Security Council, the Human Rights Council. Currently, we have a fact-finding mission, for example. I do not know if you're aware, on Sudan, that was established by the UN Human Rights Council. It's coming for a renewal in September, and it's usually such a battle, a struggle to actually get these mandates to be renewed, because they're meant to be doing the work of safeguarding the evidence for future accountability processes. So it's for all of us to be aware and to, when the time comes in September, I'd love to come back, or my colleagues would love to come back and be here and say, guys, watch how Kenya is voting, watch how your country is voting, Uganda, depending on who the Human Rights Council members are. So how do we call on our own governments and countries to vote in a way that is for the people of Sudan when the moment comes? At the UN Security Council, we have the A3+1, whether it's Sierra Leone, Algeria, and then you have the permanent members, the UK, US, France, and Russia. To what extent are the people of Sierra Leone prevailing on the government of Sierra Leone?
Should we question why some people get permanent seats on the Security Council and then other people get one that rotates?
I was going to be like, we're extending Flavia for an hour.
That's the whole question of In fact, at the UN conference last year, during the General Assembly and around it, on what the Secretary General had called, the UN of the future, the whole question of multilateralism was coming up. Is this body still serving what it was intended to serve? Where some conflicts are bigger than others. This is the largest humanitarian crisis currently in the world right now in Sudan, but our lenses are seeing Ukraine, our lenses are seeing Gaza, our lenses are they seeing DRC at all? Just like a blip.
Yeah, they're seeing what's amplified. I don't know, I know we're very short on time. Ruth Munyi is one of our reporters. I saw her earlier on, and she was talking about having gone to South Sudan with MSF, and she did a story on AI enhancing snake identification and patient care. Very, very unique story. But she wants me to ask you about whether you've also integrated any psychosocial support in terms of how you're working with those who've been displaced and those who are affected. Very briefly, if you can speak to
definitely.
That.
Oh my goodness, we cannot do research on sexual violence, for example, and not have a survivor-centered approach. Our primary responsibility is to the survivor, the women, and one of the aspects is ensuring that they actually get the psychosocial support that they need, and that our research is done in a way that is not traumatizing, that centers their needs, follows their agency, and we basically follow their lead and everything. So that's a very important point, and it's at the core and central to what it is we're trying to do, especially with the women and girls who are survivors of sexual violence. Otherwise, then we should not be in this business, because it would be causing more harm than doing good. And then lastly, Eric, I think the point you raise around evicting or not, I think a key consideration is that people who are seeking safety, who are exiting situations of conflict from their country, need safe passage. And they arrive, wherever they arrive, they should be received and be treated with the same care. Figuring out Mrima and who's from which ethnicity, no, that becomes, are they civilians who have fled a situation where they're in trouble? Kenya should be able to receive them and not put them in a situation where they're either being sent back or being put at risk. So Kenya has a responsibility in that regard, and even the countries in the region. So we cannot understate the importance of allowing people seeking safety a safe passage and to be received in a place that they are safe, and they should not have the threat of being returned to where they have run away from.
And not even profiling them and saying, you're the wife of a guy who's a soldier, who's a senior military officer. Janet Museveni was in Kenya for a long time. And even the late Garang and his family lived in Kenya when they were fighting with Sudan. Bashir would have said, remove that guy first from your country before we talk any talks. But thank you, Flavia, for joining us today.
Thank
Flavia
you.
Mongovia is the Deputy Regional Director at Amnesty International for East and Southern Africa. She's been our guest talking about the Sudan conflict. This war has been going on for 2 years. Yesterday was the second year. Let's not call it anniversary. You know what I mean?
Yes.
8 million people have been displaced internally. Now, we talk about Kenya's IDPs during the 2008 post-election violence. We're just about, what, 1 million and so. 8 million.
Internally?
Sudanese
12 million
internally
total.
IDPs. 4 million of them are out of Sudan. And you don't know what kind of condition they're living in. Some are in camps, some had good jobs. Now they're here in Kenya. They are cooking from their kitchen just to try and make ends meet. Keep it here for more conversations. In the next hour, somebody comes here and attack a mic to tunampatia mic. And he's saying, you want to become an MCA, an MP, a governor, a senator, a woman rep, a president. You only serve for 2 terms in that seat. Thereafter, you end up after kazi ingine.